Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Benjamin, for speaking again. So Benjamin Kranc, Benjamin Kranc, yes. Benjamin Kranc is a principal of Kranc Associates, a corporate immigration law firm based in Toronto. Ben received his BA with honors in computer science from York University in 1983 and his LLB from the University of Western Ontario in 1986. He was called to the Ontario Bar in 1998 and has been certified as a specialist in immigration law by the Law Society of Ontario since 1997. Ben has been recognized by Who's Who Legal as a foremost practitioner in the area of corporate immigration law, and has received Martindale Hubbell's highest peer rating, AB Preeminent. Thank you again for speaking today, Benjamin, and good luck with the presentation.
Thank you. Just make sure that everything is functioning here in terms of sharing the screen again. One second.
I'll just wait until it pops up.
Yeah, whoops. And should see it, my PowerPoint now. Alex?
Hello? Sorry, my microphone. I see it. I saw it.
Yeah, we're good?
Yep. Thank you again for speaking. Good luck.
All right, here I go. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Kranc, as you heard, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Canadian immigration system as it relates specifically to work permits. We're going to look today at two broad areas. Number one is we're going to look at the work permits, the categories, how to strategize on what kind of work permit to get, some basic background about the structure of the system, etc. And then we're going to look at COVID, how that's impacted the whole system, how you can get foreign workers here, etc., etc. Obviously, we have limited time, only half an hour, so we're just touching on some very basic elements. And certainly, you might need to drill down further in a real live situation, but this will allow you to understand the basics and know where to go from there, hopefully. So before anything, I just want to touch on one concept, which is the National Occupational Classification. Whatever category you're talking about, you need to understand what this is. This is a description of every possible job you can find, and it's based on a grid, a portion of which is here. The grid is actually too big to fit onto the screen, so I just showed a portion, but you can find the full link at that, the full grid at that link at the bottom of the screen. But you'll see across the top, you have columns, which are the various sectors, health, science, etc. And along the side, what you have are educational levels, 0 are management, and then we have A through D, which are university, sort of community college, are B, and then C are high school, and D are no particular education. Most people we're talking about are going to be in the NOC 0, A, or B categories. When you actually open a NOC 4-digit code, you'll see something like this, which gives you the details of what's actually required. And it's important to know that because no matter what you think your job is, it has to be described here with the appropriate education, the appropriate characteristics, etc. So again, this is all about the NOC, and every job you ever look to recruit for or transfer people to Canada for, you're going to need to know the NOC, and it's going to have all kinds of implications. Then we look at the work permit system in general. So the first unwritten bullet here really is that we don't let foreign workers in because we're trying to protect the Canadian labor market. But then the system kind of backs up from there and says that sometimes we'll let people in if we can get, if the employer can get what's called an LMIA, Labor Market Impact Assessment, which means that they apply to the government to show why they should be allowed to bring in a foreign worker. And we're going to look at how that works. Then the government sometimes says, we'll let you have a work permit even without an LMIA if it suits our policy guidelines. And there are various categories there, and we're going to talk about those. And there are some situations where you can come to work in Canada even without a work permit. We're going to look at those. And the most common example is a business visitor. Most people think that business visitor means that you're not working, but that's not correct. You are still working. You're just in a category that doesn't need a work permit. That being said, it is sometimes a gray area to know where business visitor ends and worker that needs a work permit starts. But we'll look at that. And there are some compliance issues that are ongoing. So as we mentioned, the first element is an LMIA. If an employer can show the government that they need a foreign worker, that they couldn't find a Canadian worker, then they will be allowed to bring in a foreign worker. The elements that an officer of Service Canada, which is where such applications go, the elements that they'll look at are summarized here from the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations. You'll see I put an asterisk at C and D. That's because without those two, you're not getting your LMIA. So you really need to make sure that is covered. And that is A, that you're actually filling a labor shortage, and B, that you're paying appropriate wages. So how do you show that you're filling a labor shortage? Well, you're going to need to advertise for 4 weeks in the last 3 months in 3 places. 2 are regular recruiting kind of websites, and 1 is the government job bank. And there you're going to have to possibly invite applications for people that match high enough on the system. But the bottom line is you're going to have to go through this, and that job bank ad needs to continue to run even after the 4 weeks until the LMIA is adjudicated. And you're going to need to show that you couldn't find an appropriate employee. $1,000 per position, and again, depending on the NOC and the occupational category, you're going to need either a transition plan or be subject to certain caps. Transition plan means that you're talking about a temporary worker, therefore, by definition, you should be filling that with a Canadian in the future. So how are you going to do that? Well, one way to do that is to say that we're going to make this person into a permanent resident, and that basically becomes the transition plan. So this is the bottom line on, or the basic idea of how you get an LMIA. In some cases, they will offer 10-day processing, depending again on the NOC. Certainly, it's not as quick as it used to be, but in theory, it's still out there, even with the COVID situation. And there's a list of the wage statistics, but again, based on NOC, at that link provided, so that you can see what would be eligible for the 10-day processing. Plus, the global talent stream is an LMIA subcategory that allows for an LMIA without recruitment in certain situations. For instance, you see I put category B, and those are some examples. There are actually, I think, 12 or 13 jobs on the list right now. And they're mostly IT kind of jobs. If you can show that you're in one of those, if that the position is in one of those occupations, you'll be able to get an LMIA without recruitment. But be aware that there is a downside. You will need to show the government that you're going to do some stuff in return. You're going to need to show increased revenue, more opportunities for Canadians, more diversity, things like this. So it is a good thing, but don't think that it's just a complete godsend. There might be some issues and reasons why you don't want to use it. So again, that's the basic idea. We go for an LMIA to justify bringing in a foreign worker, but the law says that sometimes you can get a foreign worker without an LMIA, and there are a few such categories. Number 1 is an intercompany transfer. If the person is working for the company abroad, they might be able to come to Canada without an LMIA. So there are some factors within that. First of all, the companies certainly have to be related, usually with a 50% control element. The person should be working there for 1 of the 3 last years and should be currently working there. So that is an issue sometimes. If the person has retired, you can't just send them off to Canada. You have to hire them back. Well, maybe that's not a problem, but sometimes there are issues of seniority, insurance, unions, etc. So you have to know what's going on. Plus, the person must be either an executive/senior manager or someone with specialized knowledge, which means having advanced experience plus proprietary knowledge. That used to be either or, but now it's both. And it depends on the legal basis for the intercompany transfer. There are some differences. Pretty much they're similar, but you do have to be aware that depending on where you're coming from, you might get different, have different issues, such as the length of time a person can stay. By the way, just to go back for that 1 second, under CETA, which is the European Union Trade Agreement, and the CPTPP, which is the Pacific Rim, and we'll talk about treaties again in a moment, but they've expanded the categories there to allow for management trainees, which was kind of a catch-22 before. You had people senior enough to be management trainees, but not long enough to be have their 1 year, etc. So this allows for it. And speaking of CETA, just to know that even though the UK is leaving the European Union, Canada and the UK are signing a new agreement that will basically extend the provisions of CETA as between the UK and Canada only. Besides intercompany transfers, there are a bunch of LMIA exemptions, and we're going to look at a few of those. Firstly, under CUSMA is what used to be known as NAFTA, but now it's CUSMA, and In the U.S., they call it the USMCA, by the way. But in any event, if you're on a designated list of occupations, and I've given some examples here, architects, accountants, computer systems analysts, etc. If you're on that list, you can possibly get a work permit. And to be careful again, because you do have to meet the NOC definition, as we discussed, and you have to meet whatever requirements are under the government guidelines for that occupation under the treaty. Note that prearranged employment doesn't mean that you have to actually work for the company, that you're going to become an employee of a Canadian company. Rather, you're going to possibly be, let's say, a worker in a U.S. company, and the U.S. company has a deal with the Canadian company, and you're coming to carry out the terms of that deal. But in any event, certainly this is something that can be useful for people when they're coming from the U.S. or Mexico, if they're in any particular occupation that's listed on the chart. You know, again, some of the more common ones are architects, accountants, etc. But sometimes you get hotel managers, vocational counselors, etc. Besides COVID, besides the CUSMA, we have other agreements, and just to touch on these briefly, leaving aside GATS for the moment, Chile, Colombia, and Peru are similar in structure to CUSMA, except that Colombia and Peru are have negative lists rather than a positive list. So you have to make sure your job isn't on the list in order to qualify. The ones on the right are the more modern agreements that don't really pigeonhole occupations. They just say if you are someone with a university degree, more or less. I mean, there are some details to that and exceptions. But that's the basic idea. And coming back to GATS, GATS is the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which does allow for certain professionals, but only for 3 months. Well, you might say, what's the value of that? Well, A, you might only need for someone for 3 months, but B, sometimes what we do is we get a GATS work permit quickly and then go through the LMIA in the background and kind of seamlessly transfer the person to a new work permit when that's available. And there are a lot of countries, there are 100 countries on this list on the GATS treaties. So including, for instance, India, which is a common one for IT, the IT world. So it can be of value. As we mentioned, CETA, the European Union trade agreement, allows for graduate trainees, but also has these independent professionals and contractual service suppliers with a university degree and a certain amount of experience. Again, there's no particular occupational pigeonhole. It's just this general criteria. Once again, I caution that there are exceptions, but this is the basic idea. CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which covers the countries listed at the top, also allows for the management trainees and also expands the professional category to allow for technicians, not just professionals, if they have more than 4 years experience. So again, more opportunities to bring people from other places if they qualify in these particular kinds of situations. Now, on top of those categories, there are other categories that come and go, some of them, but some of them are more common. One is reciprocal benefit, which means that rather than, if you can convince the government that you're giving opportunities to Canadians abroad, you can bring foreign workers to Canada. So sometimes that's kind of institutionalized. That is, Canada has made a deal with certain countries for working holidays, things like that. But that's there are restrictions on those, and it's a pool, so you don't really know for sure that the employee will get it. But then there are sort of private versions of that, where if your company can say, look, we have Canadians working abroad, and we bring in some foreign workers, they'll often say yes. It's more practical for larger companies, but it could be, in theory, any company if you have a Canadian working abroad. There's also something called the Francophone Mobility Program, where if an employee is coming to Canada and speaks French, whether or not they use that French in their job, if they're going anywhere outside Quebec, and if they're in a NOC 0A or B category, you can get them a work permit. So if you have a need for someone, besides any other criteria as an employer, you can utilize this. There are other categories such as significant benefit, which is kind of a catch-all. If there's any reason to override an LMIA, usually it will be for a reason of urgency. I mean, without urgency, why would an officer let you get a work permit without an LMIA? You really have to be convincing. So it's something to consider. And by the way, For people that ordinarily can apply at a port of entry, if you're worried, you can do what's called a pre-screen and send the information in advance. There are other categories that have arisen, such as emergency repair or out of warranty services, which used to need an LMIA. And finally, somebody realized that let's just allow people to come fix the widgets they've sold to Canadian companies, and other programs that come and go from time to time. So those are the two main categories of getting work permits, but people also come to work not with a work permit. And there are some categories, there are actually about 25 or so, and here are a few. So if you can fit into one of these, you can come work in Canada without a work permit. But you have to be careful about the details. There are some requirements. Canadian entertainers, for instance, are short-term, not just people that are coming here to be wedding singers for forever, things like that. So you do have to look at the details of that. As a business visitor, as I mentioned, this is sort of a controversial point. Everybody wants to say they're a business visitor because, well, you know, some common reasons are receiving or training or providing training, selling out to the general public. Meetings, well, meetings are nice, but sometimes meetings, if you're in the business of meetings, then maybe that's your job. And an officer, if you're coming and going a lot, will almost certainly at some point tell you you need a work permit. By the way, we often hear that I'm being paid from abroad, therefore I'm a business visitor. No, that's not correct. It is true that you must be paid from abroad, but that alone does not make you a business visitor. Depends if you are taking an opportunity from a Canadian. And I also hear that we're coming here for just a short period, like a day or two. Still, that does not guarantee that you are a business visitor. So, very briefly, that was the Canadian work permit system in a nutshell. That is, if you want to bring a foreign worker to Canada, the employer first needs to get an LMIA, is a basic starting point. But sometimes the law will allow you to bring a worker without an LMIA, and there are various categories and loopholes, and that's often what we're looking for. And sometimes people can come for work even without a work permit. But now COVID reared its ugly head a few months ago, and what does that do for us? So there are two aspects of this we have to worry about. Number one is, in general, what are the requirements to travel to Canada with COVID? And number two is, how does it impact work permit applications? So certainly in the beginning, there was some confusion, especially with the term essential, which means different things in different contexts, it seems, and different interpretations by different government agencies, plus some practical considerations and slowdowns, etc. Certainly the border is closed for optional / discretionary travel, which can be things like tourism, recreation, etc. But that doesn't mean the border is completely closed, and we'll get back to that. But these are currently in effect for travel from the US to December 21st, and everywhere else January 21st. Almost certainly the US one will be extended, but we'll see how that goes. So people that can travel to, or rather reasons to allow entry to Canada exceptional to that restriction are people of national interest, certain family situations, and for our purposes, most importantly, certain workers, and then we'll discuss that. But when it comes to entering Canada, everyone is subject to quarantine, even if you're a Canadian citizen. So you must travel by plane wearing a mask. If you're traveling by plane, you must wear a mask. You have to use this new ArriveCAN app to register before you travel. Once you're here, you need to quarantine for 14 days. And again, this applies to everybody. And if there's an employer involved, the employer must sort of underwrite this and must guarantee that the employee will do it and take responsibility. So this applies to everybody that can come to Canada, except if you're in a quote unquote essential sector, which are these. Now, even within these, there are all kinds of details, which I've given the link there for further breakdown. But again, it doesn't matter if you're a Canadian citizen or a Canadian citizen or a foreign worker or whatever you are. This applies to everybody. You must quarantine unless you're in one of these fields. And as I mentioned, if you're the employer, you kind of guarantee the compliance, and if not, you could have sanctions. So that's in terms, we just discussed what quarantine or entry issues there are with regard to coming to Canada, but who's allowed to get a work permit to Canada or come to work? Number one, those already having a work permit. So you happen to be abroad and you want to come back to Canada on your valid work permit, you can do it. but you got to make sure you have evidence that your employer is functioning, because we cannot assume that that is true at this moment. Number two, people coming from the United States can basically apply to get a work permit as they were before. And just to be clear, this is anyone who's physically in the US that doesn't need a visa. So you don't have to be an American citizen. If you're there, you can still just come to Canada as before. As I mentioned, you might want to pre-screen in this kind of situation just to make sure you have that aspect at least dealt with. But basically, you don't have to be quote unquote essential. You can be anybody, but you need to, if you do come, you're going to need to quarantine unless you are essential. And then there are people that come from anywhere other than the US. And they ordinarily, let's say you would have come from the UK and didn't need a visa, you could just hop on the airplane. Well, now you have to apply online and then sort of make a secondary application to pull your application from the pile. And there, if you're essential, you can still get a work permit in a relatively quick period of time, probably about 2 weeks. Some ancillary issues that, if you are trying to renew your work permit, normally, first of all, you apply inland online to do that, but some people don't want to wait and they want a quote unquote flagpole, which means to exit Canada briefly and return. And at first, under COVID rules, that was not allowed, but now it is allowed. And if you're changing employers, you can get an expedited kind of work permit inside Canada these days. Restoration, which means if you've gone out of status, normally you only have 90 days, but the government allowed till December 31st. Now, that might not sound like such a bonus given that today is December 10th, but in July, this was seen as a rather big bonus. We'll see what they do for beyond December 31st. And other things like biometrics are waived for people inside the country and things like that. So there are all kinds of considerations. So in summary, you can still come to Canada for work under COVID. You just need to consider the issues. Where are you coming from? What is the purpose? Whether you're going to need to quarantine and whether you have compliance issues. So I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions. I know that was very quick, but of course, this is, we only have a brief period of time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second here. Okay. I just wanted to cover the basic points. So in summary, to get a work permit in Canada, just ordinary issues. An employer needs to show that there's a shortage through the LMIA process, but sometimes the government will allow you to bring a foreign worker without an LMIA if you can find an exemption, including intercompany transfer, professionals, reciprocal benefit, and some others. And sometimes you can come without a work permit at all, but still carry out your function. And on added layer now with COVID is you can still come to work, but you have to deal with those elements of either applying online if you're not coming from the US and or need a visa, isolation/quarantine if you unless you are in an essential sector, etc. Once again, I hope that was of value, and I welcome any questions.